What addictions had impacted your life, and how?
Addiction is a form of self-medication. Self-medicating. So if it's drugs, you're trying to forget something. I think with sex, you're trying to feel something. Anything we do to an excess is based on an emotional plateau. Something we're missing, or something we think we're missing. Or some people just are trying to forget. Anybody that I ever knew that was on drugs years ago were trying to forget something. And drugs was a form of escape. Oh, I do know somebody who has a bad habit. But he's functional. He gets it in the morning and then he can function all day long. He's a productive person. So addiction across the board is not the same. Everybody doesn't just fall apart. There are some people I've known that just couldn't function afterwards. Addiction is personal too. And until the person who is addicted comes to the place where they see a need to change, you can't love them through it. You can't encourage them through it. You can't deny them things through it. You can't penalize them for it. Addiction is something that has to be dealt with individually on a personal basis. How a person feels about themselves or whatever's going on in their lives is the only way to combat addiction. Because even those who go to counseling or go to these rehab centers come back out, and a lot of them go back to doing what they were doing before.
Why is addiction a disease that we have to understand? The main reason for this is 21 million people in the United States have the disease of addiction. 15 million of those suffer from an alcohol use disorder, and 3 million of those suffer from an opioid use disorder. An opioid use disorder is an addiction to things like painkillers and heroin. It's the #1 cause of injury-related death in our country. The #1 cause, more than car accidents and gun violence. In 2015, we had over 50,000 people die of overdose. 50,000 people of a preventable disease. The CDC even called this an epidemic. And so now what we have are people who have a disease that we can identify, that we can treat, but we're not. That we can understand addiction from a human standpoint. So we need 3 things to survive. You need food, you need water, you need dopamine. We need dopamine because it's the chemical responsible for motivation. It's this thing that's responsible for us going and making a friend, having a mother have a bond with a baby. It's the thing that motivates us when we do good to do better. When somebody pats you on the back and says, "Good job," and you go to do something more significant, that's because your dopamine has gotten pinged and it's just something pushing you, this invisible chemical that's pushing you along the path. On a normal day, we even know how much dopamine we're supposed to have. So on Monday morning, when I wake up and I have to get up and I go to work, I live in the range of about 50 nanograms per deciliter of dopamine. That sits in the central part of my brain, and that's required for me to get out of bed and go get that first cup of coffee. Now, what about the worst day? The really bad day? The day you call your office and you fake vomit in the phone and you decide not to go in. You're like, "I just can't make it." That's about 40 nanograms per deciliter. So not much lower, but low enough to where you just want to sit around in your pajamas all day and do nothing. What about the best day ever? The day where all at once you win the lottery, you have 2% body fat, and you're living on the beach. All of those things happen at the exact same time. We even know that one. That's 100 nanograms per deciliter. Our brain is meant to go all the way to there. It's not really meant to go above. And we can look at things like your favorite food, which is like 94 nanograms per deciliter. And sex, 92 nanograms per deciliter. Bummer, right? Couldn't have predicted that. Maybe they need to redo that research. But at the same time, we know that we're supposed to live within this relative normal state between 40 on a horrible day and 100 on our best day. So what happens when we add a chemical into the brain like methamphetamine? This chemical is really important because it pushes us way past that 100 nanograms per deciliter. In fact, it actually pushes up to 1,100 nanograms per deciliter, more than 10 times the amount of dopamine that our brain should be making. And then, if we look at things like marijuana or alcohol or heroin, these are things that push it up into the high hundreds. This is not what we're supposed to be doing.
What addictions have impacted your life and how?
Addictions have impacted my life in countless and numerous ways, and it's not because I'm a first-hand user. Being adjacent to people, their addictions can take you down and run you through the mud. Now, we can put a positive spin on it, but I'm going to talk about the derogatory side of addiction and how it hurts. I've experienced, because of people's small-time addictions, homelessness. I've experienced loss of relationships. I have experienced violence. I have experienced uncertainty, which all led to depression and anxiety and PTSD. So one bad apple is spoiling the bunch.
Seemingly biased to negativity and social judgments. A person who's known to be a liar could decide one day that they were going to start telling the truth, but even if they do, they'll still probably be known by most people as that mother that lies all the time. However, a person who's known to be honest could get caught in one lie, and then all of their friends will immediately start questioning their honesty. So I think that we find negative information to be more valuable and more enlightening. We respond and react to bad news, but often fail to appreciate good news, which is why your local news station often looks like this. This just in, everything gives you cancer, your neighbors are trying to kill you, and the world is going to hell. Back to you, Bob. This is also why politicians running for office often don't focus on how awesome they are and instead focus on how much their opponent sucks. Negativity also appears to be contagious. If you spend a lot of time around people who are mean or gossipy or sad, that can rub off on you.
I'm going to tell you a couple anecdotal stories. I had a partner who used substances, and I call them the pills, powder, and potions, and that's what a number of people are on, and they're socially acceptable in certain circles. And what I learned is you stick with your kind. If I'm an addicted person, I will find other addicted people who will support this habit. When somebody wants to leave an addiction, they have to leave those people behind that are still practicing the habits of the addiction. I had a loved one who used to cope from trauma they had experienced as a child, and this trauma, because this was a loved one that I met along the way. It affects me immediately when interacting with them. It's hard to love somebody when they're addicted, and they even recognize that. And I love this person very deeply, so much to the point it was hard to say to them and recognize that they did not love themselves, and so they couldn't love me properly either.
You should understand that this area of the brain called the limbic system, which includes, but it's not limited to, the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, are responsible for reward. And the fact that we can look on an MRI and see these parts of the brain working, and we can see them working in a patient who is not on any drugs, and those that have been on illicit substances for a long time, and see major differences in how these structures work, is really important because it allows us to start to understand things like behavior. We can see that all of the focus is on the dopamine part of the brain. Remember that nucleus accumbens and ventral tegmental area that we talked about? In that part of the brain, when you've been taking things like methamphetamine for a long time, every time that you take the methamphetamine, it goes from 1,100, then the next time maybe it's 900, then 600, then 500, then 200, then 100. Then you're required to take that drug even to get you up to that normal level of 50 nanograms per deciliter. Let's say we found this person, we get them into treatment and we remove that drug. Now we have people whose dopamine goes all the way down to as low as 10 nanograms per deciliter. And on their best day ever, it's only 20 nanograms per deciliter. These are numbers that matter, and we're going to keep hammering on these because when you have 10 nanograms per deciliter, you can't get out of bed. You can't get up to put your clothes on and go to a job interview or to even take care of yourself or your family. When we lack dopamine, the body craves it. And when you crave dopamine, you get into survival mode. And that leads to primal action. And that primal action is a lot of times the behavior that we see. How can they take grandma's jewelry? How can they steal a credit card? How can they pawn something that they owned? Their brain is telling them that they are not going to survive if they don't get dopamine. And the thing that gives them the dopamine that they need, as far as they know, is that drug of choice.
I've seen that person do hard drugs, over-the-counter drugs, socially acceptable drugs that you can buy at your local liquor market, or you can go get a